Good morning. I was thinking as people were coming in, how many people are here from how many places. We've got folks here from 2 other states, as well as those that are local. Several have driven miles. Some have put themselves up in a motel overnight, and others have gotten up real early to be here for the services and to drive several hours to be here with us. And what this speaks to me of is how broad the topics are that we are talking about and how widespread the effects of damages to our homes and our marriages are, and the ripple effects that are seen with so many. So I want to talk today, as we continue our thoughts this week, on the subject of pornography and the after effects of pornography, ripples in the marriages. And today, in this lesson, we're going to talk about grief and loss in the relationships of marriage. I'm going to make this lesson a little broader than just when a marriage breaks up. This lesson will deal with when a courtship breaks up, that is before marriage, and will also deal with when death comes and visits us and a marriage ends because of death. So the things we're going to say have a little broader application than just the breakup of a marriage. But all of those things have something in common, and that is that they pull our hearts apart. They damage us real deep to the very core of who we are, or they can do that. So the topics today are going to deal with everything from a sudden break in the relationship to an erosion in the relationship, a slow death, if you will. And we're going to talk about that in this particular lesson. I'm very aware that that a thing does not have to be eternal to be immortal. So we'll try to make it to be immortal without being eternal. So that means that we're going to get out in time to go eat lunch. So I invite you just to get your outlines and to study along with us. Basically, relationships are easy to form, and we get connected to one another. And as we do that, we let our guard down, and we let people into our personal space. And that can work very well for us, to where our heartstrings are actually entwined. But the breaking up of that relationship is extremely painful, pulling apart, as you may be aware. If you are married, then I want to encourage you to be working on the relationship that is about blending you together. What holds marriages together is not primarily love. The reason for longevity in marriage is primarily commitment. There are times that we are not very loving, but we do still need to be committed. There are times that romance is not necessarily the key point of our relationship. It's hard to love somebody when they're sick and ended up throwing up. It's hard to have romantic feelings toward someone like that unless you're a little strange. And if you are, you need to talk to me. But it's hard to love when sometimes we have the strains and the struggles of life, and it's hard to feel that loving, close connection. But commitment is what holds us together. And that's what holds us together with God. The feelings of romance will come and go in a relationship, but commitment holds it together. Intimacy is also something that holds a relationship together. When I talk about intimacy, I ask people in marital counseling, it's like, how intimate are you? And what they think I'm asking them is how many times how's your sex life? And that's not what I'm asking when I ask about intimacy. Intimacy, as we talked a little bit yesterday about, is from a Hebrew word, yada. And that Hebrew word is what is translated intimacy. It is found 960-something times in the Old Testament. And 900, or approximately 900 of those times, it's talking about relationship with God, intimacy, connection, tied together, oneness, intertwined. And that's what yada means. It is used some 60 times in terms of a marital relationship, but it is prominently dealing with our relationship with God. And that is that close, intimate connectedness that we are as one with God, kind of like Elijah, who was walking with God so much that one day it was closer to God's house than it was to his, and he just went on home with God. He never saw death. Well, that would be the ultimate model for us in this. But many people in marriage appear to be trying more, knowingly or unknowingly, they appear to be trying more to drive wedges and to break up a home instead of looking for ways to have the home unite. We do that as we get busy with life, and we live in silos, and we live parallel lives rather than intertwined lives. And sometimes the best times of our day are those times when we are our least best. We get up and we go to work and we spend whatever time we do there, and then we come home and we got all kinds of things to do, and we're just so busy with life that we miss each other. And somehow that intimacy can break down in our life. The purpose of this lesson is to talk about how to survive when that intimacy is broken, and by death, by divorce, by pending separation, or by the slow death where home becomes a war zone. In marriage, the Bible has a lot to say about marriage. It began in the Garden of Eden, and God formed not only man from the dust of the ground, but he made a helper for him, Eve. And I want you to note that one man and one woman for life was the plan from the Garden of Eden. The first marriage ceremony God officiated. And in that marriage ceremony, we have a combining of three people or three beings in that commitment in marriage. God was called to witness, and God did the joining together. The man and the woman committed themselves to each other, and that triangle was that God joined them together. That covenant was not just between the man and the woman. It was between the man, the woman, and God. And God was called in witness, and God said, what God has joined together, let not man put asunder. And that man could be the woman or the man in the marriage, or someone else that decides this home's going to break up. Well, many people have trampled on God's plan. But God's plan is still his plan. One man for one woman for life. In the days of pop bottles, anybody remember those days? You had some pop bottles where no deposit and no return, and that was true, and with some, and then one to a customer. And that's the plan for marriage. That the one you choose, you need to learn how to love that person. In the days of the Bible, they did not have American kind of romance in the Bible. What they had is, in many cases, they had arranged marriages. You go to the Old Testament, and you find, here's a servant goes and finds a wife for this kid that's back home. And those two had to learn how to love each other. As a matter of fact, in the New Testament, what we find is that older women are to teach the younger women several things, among which is to love their husband. Well, why would you have to teach someone to love their husband if they already loved them? And the point is that some things have to be taught. Love is something we grow in, something we have to nurture and develop, or else it's going to go away. Romans, the 7th chapter, says that a man is bound by law to his wife as long as they both shall live. But if he dies, then the marriage is over. And what he is basically saying there is that death severs the bond. Divorce can also sever the bond. And separation can strain the bond. And 1 Corinthians 7 we'll talk about quite a bit. I want to note with you that in 1 Corinthians 7, verses 33 and 34, that in that passage, Paul references people who are single. And he talks about the behaviors that single people would have over those that are married people. And he talks about the married person. And he says the man who is married looks to the ways of his wife, how he might please her. Likewise, the wife to the ways of the husband, how she might please him. In other words, that center and circumference in a relationship is looking how you can please each other, not how you can get on each other's last nerve. Somehow, in marriages, we get this backwards. Here's a standard wedding vow. And I ask people when we do marital counseling, what was your marriage vow? And many folks don't even remember what it was. So I suggest you find whoever officiated and you have them to type that out for you, and that you put that in a prominent place in your home, because that's your promise. That's your commitment. Well, here's one that we might use. We come together with God and the witnesses, and it says basically, I take you to be my lawfully wedded husband or wife, to hold from this day forth, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health. I promise to love, to honor, and to cherish you, and forsaking all others, give myself to you and you alone, until death shall part us. Look back at that. Keep myself for you and for you alone. Guess who that leaves out? That leaves me out. I promise in a marriage vow to keep myself for that person, and that person promises to keep themselves for me, to where what we are doing is surrendering our outlet to the other person. That's the marriage vow. Now, the book of Ecclesiastes tells us, and to that we say I do or I will, but the book of Ecclesiastes tells us, when you vow a vow before God, Ecclesiastes 5, when thou vowest a vow before God, defer not to keep it, for I have no pleasure in fools. Better is it that you wouldn't vow than that you would vow and not pay. We look at other passages, such as in the book of Numbers and Deuteronomy, and those are up here on our board and in your handouts. And those passages talk about the importance of a vow, that you do not try to get out of the vow. In Ecclesiastes 5, again, it says, better is it that thou wouldest not vow than that you would vow and not pay, for I have no pleasure in fools. God calls the person who violates their marriage vow a fool. That's pretty strong language, God. You must be pretty much wanting us to commit ourselves to this. That's the seriousness of what we're saying here when we are involved in a marriage vow, and we keep our word. Our yea is yea, and our nay is nay, and that's what begins to form this bond with one another, to where we have basically surrendered our rights to the other person, and they've surrendered theirs to us. That's what marriage is. And with that comes this trust bond. Well, the trust bond is part of what gets us woven together, intimate, close to one another, committed to each other. That's the big part of that. But I want to suggest to you, in a relationship, what is not nourished dies. What is nourished grows. Someone had this poem, two lovers walking down the street. She trips and he whispers, careful, sweet. Now wed and on the self-same street, she trips And he mutters, "Pick up your feet." Well, in that particular thing, what happened? Well, we moved from the loving, caring couple that we were into someone that just we tolerate each other. What happened in there? Somewhere we're not working on the relationship. Somewhere we have drifted apart. And in the relationship, if we want it to stay together, we've got to work on keeping it together. And there are many ways to do that. Those are topics for other lessons. But some marriages have just kind of degenerated, and it's a slow endurance test, as one person said, to see which one kicks off first, so the other one can enjoy life. That's not a very nice way to put it. But some marriages are like that. Well, marriage is intended to be for a lifetime. We've established that, I think. And it is a matter of leaving and cleaving. That's what that intimacy and connection is about. A man is to leave his father and mother and is to cleave to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. In other words, they look to ways they can please each other, to stick together, to join together, look for ways that they can tighten the bond between each other. It's intended to be for a lifetime. Leaving and cleaving does not mean that we need to quit when things are not going right. It includes talking things out, praying things through, being patient as we trust God and invite Him to work with us in both of our hearts, being willing to admit when we are wrong, seeking forgiveness from one another, and seeking God's counsel regularly in our homes, in our studies. That's the design of marriage. When either party or both neglect the marriage, the result is a lack of intimacy. And without intimacy, that all that is left is if there is anything going on in the bedroom, it is less satisfying, and people begin to look elsewhere often, or they just become sexually anorexic in their relationship, and they pull apart. Israel, the word cleave is used with Israel in Deuteronomy 13:4. And there Israel was to put away all idols and to cleave to God. That word cleave is used there. And that's God's design for marriage, is you put away everything else and that we are tied together in marriage. So that marriage is a sacred thing in God's sight. Now in courtship, most examples of courtship in the Bible, with the exception of the Song of Solomon, that most of those are about union or about coming together basically to start a family and then learning to grow and love each other. They did not start out with the two being madly in love with each other. Most of those did not. Well, how do we get out of the marriage commitment? To start with, as we've already said, God intended it to be something permanent. But getting out of the marriage commitment can involve one of three things, or maybe several. Death severs the bond. Romans, the 7th chapter, says that. Separation, we'll talk about in 1 Corinthians 7. And then also divorce, and we'll talk about divorce as well. But death severs the bond. Romans 7 and verse 2 says that the man is bound by law to his wife so long as they both live. But if he dies, then the marriage is over. She's free to marry. And what that means is that when death happens, the person is no longer married. They are single in God's sight again. The bond has been broken. The marriage is over. The vow was until death shall separate. So the marriage is over. Many times when death occurs and a widow or a widower is left, they have a lot of trouble breaking the bond. Some will continue to wear their wedding rings, and even some will set places at the table they go through a big grieving process because they have not yet fully accepted that the marriage is over. I'm single again. That doesn't mean we have to go out and find somebody else. Fact is, usually that is a mistake, to go out immediately and just try to replace what was lost. The grieving process needs to happen. In the Old Testament, when someone died, that there was a period of time that the grieving process was there. In this country, that was there. Women used to dress in black if they were in the grieving process over the death of a husband. And there's just certain things that if you were newly widowed that you just didn't do. That was considered to be disgraceful. Things have changed, unfortunately, in this country. So we move fast, but moving fast to another relationship is not always best. I know some folks that have really got themselves in a mess by jumping, trying to replace what was lost, rather than dealing with their grief. 1 Corinthians 7 also talks about the marriage bond being broken. But divorce is spoken of in the Bible, and not usually in a very positive context. Fact is, I don't know of a context where it's spoken of as this is the thing to do. But we go to Malachi chapter 2 and verse 16. We talked a little bit about that in our class, where we find God hates divorce. I hate putting away. And but he also, in that same context, talks about the things that lead to divorce. And that is dealing treacherously with the wife of your youth. And he says that 4 times in the book of Malachi. Treacherously means that we treat a person in such a way that we're actually trying to get rid of. We are just kind of sabotaging the relationship. We are being unfaithful in terms of our emotional attachment, maybe even physically. We're being unfaithful. But so we read in there about dealing treacherously, and God was upset with them, and basically God said, that's what's kept my hand from reaching out to you and answering your prayers. You're wondering, where is God, that he hadn't reached out his hand, that he can't hear us? Where is God? And the answer is, your sins have separated between you and your God. One of those sins is captured in that word, dealing treacherously in your home. That would be the guy that's the old bear, the person that is just obnoxious at home, being difficult, rude, or the wife who is being that way, dealing treacherously. Look at that word and do a little study on that. But God hates something, as I said in the class this morning, God hates something worse that he does divorce. And that is that he hates a cheating mate. That we do not step outside the marriage for sexual gratification. Certainly that involves a physical act, but in this weekend we're talking about pornography. And you don't step outside the marriage to have fantasy sex with somebody else. That's against God's will. That's a violation of your marriage vow. That's a violation of keeping myself for you and you alone. I've invited somebody else into this, and you may not know about it. All right. Well, do you know that God reached a point with Israel that he just gave up? He says, this is enough. And Jeremiah 3 and verse 8 says, talking about God and his marriage to Israel, therefore I gave her a writing of divorcement and put her away. God was divorced. God hates it. But that was something that he was driven to because Israel would not be faithful to him. And so he was driven to the point of a divorce. And that's when they went into captivity, and they stayed for an extended period of time. Well, there's an article that I was going to read, but I think for sake of time I won't read it all. But I referenced it for you, and it's by Wayne Jackson, it's a preacher, that talks about dealing treacherously with your mate. What he says is, the book of Malachi contains a series of scathing rebukes against the Hebrew people in the post-captivity period. The Israelites had drifted into a state of spiritual lethargy and were involved in numerous manifestations of sin, not the least of which involved violation of their marriage vows and covenants. Malachi declared that the Hebrew people flooded the altar of God with their tears, and yet they were puzzled as to why he rejected their worship. They failed to recognize that the moral dimension of their lives was in shambles. And, listen to this, Jehovah has been a witness between you and the wife of your youth, against whom you have dealt treacherously, even though she is your companion and the wife of your covenant. Malachi 2 and verse 14. Well, that's what Israel's problem was. And that's what ended up in a divorce as God put her away and gave her a writing of divorcement. So divorce can sever the relationship. And no marriage is perfect, certainly because it's the union of two imperfect people. Each person in that marriage needs to work on themselves, and together they need to work on their marriage, to give focus on that, and not just to drift through life. Yesterday is today, and today is tomorrow. That's the same thing over and over and over, and we don't ever accomplish anything. We don't ever get stuff fixed where we can move on. Well, there's ways to do that, and that's a whole other topic. But sometimes in a marriage, we have partners, and sometimes it's both partners, who are both narcissistic, egocentric, and worldly minded. And when you have that kind of combination, that dynamic going on, you have almost hell on earth. And the number of matrimonial battlegrounds is legion when you have that kind of attitude going on in a home. Well, sometimes one person is more committed to a marriage than the other. And one person is the faithful spouse, and the other is just bound and determined to do whatever it is they want to do. And so that narcissism can lead them into a cheating kind of a deal. So what do we do when we have a breakup? What do we do when it's over? In other words, we're going to go ahead and divorce. Is that the end? Is divorce the end? No. I suggest to you that divorce is not the end, that it's only the beginning of a different type of relationship. I don't know what I did in my notes. I'm going to have to go off of this. My notes are all scrambled. All right. But it's the beginning of a different type of relationship. Divorce is a gift that keeps on giving. When couples go into a divorce court, and if there are children involved, you've got custody issues and you've got other things that go on, you've got the ramification and the ripple effect we talked about to the third and fourth generation. It gives that way and can cause tremendous ripples in the family, and also establishing for the children that home is not a safe place because your home got ripped out from under you. It's not safe. Divorce has ripple effects in that people will ask you even years later about your marital status. And I find it kind of interesting when you fill out a form, it wants to know, are you married, are you divorced, are you single? I thought divorced people were single, at least sometimes. But nevertheless. All right, so when there is a breakup in a marriage, then there is a need to regroup when we have considered this marriage is ended. And what that calls for is a shift in our mindset. So whether it's by death or whether it's by separation, then or by divorce, then there is a change in the relationship. And during that time, surviving this means that we need to accept what our current status is. And that shakes us to our core. So during that time, we need to keep our minds centered on God. And what would God have me do? I suggest more often than, I suggest it all the time, is that all you have to worry about in life is just doing the next right thing. You don't have to worry about a year from now. You worry about doing the next right thing, and after a while, you've got a series of right things going on. Do the right thing. And remember that in the core of all of this, God is the anchor. It is important to acknowledge that I'm off base, I'm off bubble right now. And I need to be careful because my life is not in equilibrium when there has been a severance in the marriage due to death or divorce. And at some point, we recognize that there are some new horizons out there. That divorce is not the end. It is the end of a relationship, but it is not the end of your life. And that there is life beyond. It may not feel like it at that particular moment or during that particular, as you try to recover from that. But there is life. Does God have anything in store for you? In other words, if you are divorced, does that mean you're done and God's done with you? Not necessarily. What it means is that you are being challenged to take your life in a whole different direction. That starts with drawing near to Christ and being true to our values as Christians. It also calls for us to regroup in almost everything, our thinking and so forth, and understand that we are grieving as we move through the process. We're readjusting. We're readjusting to friends. We're readjusting maybe to living by ourselves. We're readjusting to relationship with family. And during that time, we need to be involved in self-care. Many people just kind of let themselves go at times like this. But taking care of ourselves during this time is important. I would ask the question to those that are divorced or those that have experienced the death of a loved one, what are your fears? And sometimes we're afraid of being alone. We're afraid of the unknown. How do I go on? Those questions all come up. And we need to get some help with those. Where do we find our help? Often people who have also gone through the same thing can be our best natural helpers, our best natural resources. And we talk to others who have gone through that. Sometimes we may need to get professional counseling, or we talk to others who have some wisdom. And by the way, there are a lot of wise people out there. You don't have to pay for wisdom. There are a lot of wise people out there. But be careful who you get your advice from. There's some people that really steer you astray. In terms of self-care, we need to look at getting our proper rest. Do you know that one of the big problems in the American culture is that people are walking around sleep deprived? We don't do our best sleeping our best work when we are sleep deprived. But many people go around, they don't have enough sleep. I ask some people, how many hours a day in a 24-hour period do you sleep? And some of them will tell me 2 to 4. And it's like, well, how can you do that and function with a clear mind? Maybe some people can do that, but most cannot. And our body begins wearing down when we don't get the proper rest. And you know the next one's going to be on here is nourishment, that we need to nourish our body. The Bible in Ephesians 5 talks about no man ever yet hated his own body, but nourishes and cherishes it, just like Christ does the church. So while we're going through our emotional process, we need to take care of ourselves physically. That's part of protecting our body and optimizing our body to do what God wants it to do. By the way, our bodies don't belong to us. They belong to the Lord. We're told to, in Romans 12, we're told to glorify God in our body, and that we're to offer it as a living sacrifice before God, which is your reasonable service. God asks us to present our bodies like we would bring an animal sacrifice before God. What we do is we don't do animal sacrifices. We are the sacrifice. And we present our body in much of a worship kind of thing to God as a living sacrifice. Fact is, where it says this is your reasonable service, that word service is a word that is also translated worship. This is your reasonable worship, that we present our bodies as a living sacrifice before God. That's not proskuneo worship like we're doing this morning, but that is personal worship, which is a different word. But it's a word that's also translated worship. We need to develop a plan to face our loneliness, that when we're used to working as a unit, now when we're working by ourselves, then we need to face the loneliness that is there. And believe me, the four walls can get awful close sometimes. You can get pretty old watching the paint dry in your house. So how are we going to address the loneliness? That's going to involve fellowship, finding things and activities to do that are helpful when this relationship has ended in divorce or death. So what are we going to be doing now? And that sometimes calls on us to do some recreating with ourselves, to redefine ourselves. What is it I like to do? What are some things that are on my bucket list I haven't done? How can I use myself to the glory of God? Now, 1 Corinthians 7 talks about the single person. And it talks about how this person can give themselves wholly to the ministry. So we ask the question, rather than being lonely and sitting around on a pity pot, that what we may want to do is ask, how can I be of more service in the kingdom? What are some things I can do that now that I am free from a marriage relationship, what are some things I can do to move forward? Some have decided to do some missionary work, to go on some of the tours, maybe to Moldova or some other places. And so they go and they get involved. Others decide, well, I can work and I can earn money, but now that I have maybe some different income, then what I can do is use that to the glory of God through donations of some sort. Maybe I can be of assistance. One thing I really like, and by the way, if anybody wants to do this, we can use you in Plymouth. We're a small congregation out in the middle, almost, you have to travel almost 2 hours, hour and a half to find another place to worship. But what some people have started doing is that they are of means and are free enough to where they can move to a location and help a local congregation that may be struggling. When you read your Bible, do you read of an entourage of people that traveled with the apostles? They traveled and they were the companions of Paul as he would go to a place and stay a little bit, then he'd leave and go another place. Well, what happened to those days? We kind of tend to be more stationary. But a person who is single can have more freedoms to kind of come and go, and maybe more opportunities. Out in Charlottesville, Virginia, they have kind of a rotation of people. There's a congregation out in Texas that kind of adopted that group, and what they do is they will send some of their members to spend a few weeks with them, and then those members come back and they send some more. And it's a small congregation that's just starting up. Everybody that's local is a brand new Christian. There is not much maturity in the congregation except for one family. So what they're doing is they're helping that congregation to grow. I believe that's a very biblical pattern. A single person can help with that. Think about it. When we are separated or when we are single, we need to be careful about self-medication. And by that, I mean that sometimes when people get single, that they decide maybe their nerves are bad. So they're going to get hooked on some medication. Some of those medications really do hook you. Others will maybe pick up alcohol or get stuck on NyQuil. By the way, NyQuil is how much proof? I think it's 90 proof. So you take too much of that, has the same effect of drinking a toddy. So you want to be careful on that. But self-medication. And some people get real hooked on their medications. Drug abuse is a whole other story. But be careful during times like this, that while we're trying to take the edge off, while we're trying to cope with life and separation, be careful where you don't get caught up in addiction. And also, I would suggest that during times of when a relationship is ended, we need to realize how vulnerable we are. That loneliness can cause us maybe to do things that are out of character for us. So be careful that we're not vulnerable, that we're not a target for somebody else to exploit or to use because we're just trying to address our loneliness. And then connecting with a support network. The church is going to be your best support network. And that is that we are there, should be there for one another. We are the church. We don't go down to the church. We don't go to church. We are the church. And as the called out, we are expected to help one another, to be there for one another, to support each other. And that's the network that we need. Sometimes when people need us, they need us at strange hours. And it may be that they're really struggling maybe with something in the evening, and they need to call and talk with us about that. Financially, when there is a break, financially there is a regrouping that is needed. Sometimes there's monies that are available, and it's not as much of a problem. But in other cases, the husband and the wife have not worked together closely. And it's not unusual for someone to say, I don't know anything about our finances. He always took care of that, or she always took care of that. And so the one that is left now is left with, what do I do? How do I deal with finances? And that calls for a regrouping and for some support, some help with finances. I've helped more than one family with the budgeting process and figuring out even how to pay the bills. And while I'm not electronically a guru, there are some people who are, and they can help with that. But financially, don't be afraid to ask and let folks know when they say, what can we do to help you? Don't be afraid to tell them, you know, I really need some help getting my budget together and getting my bills in a sequence of some sort, or in shaving down some things. I need some help with all this. So there's an obligation for the person who is single, an obligation for that person to allow people to help them. Do you know Christians sometimes have trouble with that? They don't mind helping other people, but they don't want to be helped. Did Jesus say, Acts chapter 1, it's more blessed to give than to receive? That when we don't allow people to help us, we rob them of a blessing. I would also suggest that during this time that we avoid making any radical decisions for at least a year. In other words, giving ourselves time to allow grief to work through. And it's not going to be an event. There's going to be periods of time. Adjust our financial plan, create a new budget, and if there are children, small children, we need to adjust to them. If it's a divorce, we need to figure out the custody plan, because now instead of one home, we have two homes if there is a divorce. And the children sometimes have two different sets of rules. Co-parenting is a piece that comes in there if there is a divorce. Socially, we need to be careful who we confide in, because what we tell, once it's out there, it's out there. So be careful who you tell your story to, who knows your secrets. Don't isolate ourselves. And let someone know if we're feeling panicked or numb. When folks are separate, sometimes they go into depression. And that depression sometimes can take them to some very dark places. Sometimes it becomes suicidal ideations, that is, thinking about it, and sometimes it becomes actually attempts. That's not the norm, but it does occur occasionally. People kind of get down in the dumps. Be there for each other. There was a lady up our way that actually ultimately did commit suicide. She was divorced and raising a little kid on her own, and financially had all kinds of issues and a pretty wild lifestyle before she became a Christian, and she just decided not to deal with it. And so she killed herself. And looking back at that, what were the warning signs? What were things that we could learn from the way she was responding? Well, one was that she needed to reach out more, but also we need to reach out to her and to include her. Did you ever notice that when people are single, sometimes they are the odd one out? Is you have an activity and you invite several couples, then you invite the single one. And then the single one is sitting there by themselves with all the couples, and it just kind of, I don't know if we think about this a lot, but sometimes that makes that one feel like I'm the odd one, odd out. And then there are the others who are the matchmakers who say, well, we need to invite them, they're by themselves, let's invite her. And so they try to match you up. You want to really be careful on that because you can get some pretty weird situations going. And you might have to tell them, listen, I can pick out my own date if I'm a date person. Social landscape is going to change. Open our eyes and be aware of new opportunities and new chapters that are there. God can heal broken lives, and He can make new things possible. We may have an outlook on divorce and see divorce as the end, but I would challenge you this morning to see this as the beginning of a new relationship. A failure to, we see it as a failure to meet God's ideal, but is it the end? No, it's a new beginning. And that's how God relates to us when He forgives us. He can forgive the guilt of our sin, but the consequence of our sin often lingers. I think of Moses. As he had led the people of God through the wilderness, he accepted God's challenge, however reluctantly at first, and he had accepted God's challenge to be a leader of God's people. But Moses sinned when he struck the rock instead of speaking to it. And God told him, because of that, you will not enter the promised land, but you can see it. And so Moses went up on a mountain, and there he could see from that mountain top, he could see all the way from Dan to Beersheba across the plain. He could see the Negev. He could see the towns and the things that God said, this is the land that I promised to your father Abraham that I would give to his descendants. But you can't go in because of your unbelief. And so Moses died, having seen the hope of a better tomorrow, but not being able to achieve it because he got in God's way. I want to suggest to you that we need to let go and let God have a way in our life, whether we are together or whether we are single, and to let go and let God, because more important than the marriage is your relationship to God. Whoever loves father or mother, husband or wife more than me is not worthy of me. And the one that does not take up his cross daily and follow me is not worthy of me. We can spend our life looking at the past, but the rest of our life is not meant to be lived in the past. That's where remorse and regret are. That's also where lessons learned are. And so let's learn our lessons from the things that are behind us, but not let our past define us. Let's look at today. What are today's opportunities? How do I redeem the time today? And how do I serve God in this present moment? And what are my plans for the future? Even though we are single, there can be a brighter tomorrow. There can be a better days. When one chapter ends, it's time for a new chapter to begin. It is time to rewrite our life scripts. And what I mean by that is we often think, well, I thought I would go through my teen years, find a mate, get married, have kids, establish a home, have a career, so on and so forth, and live happily ever after. Whoever wrote that happily ever after must have been on drugs, because ever after ain't happily. Ever after has ups and downs. It has rocky roads, and it has some really good times, but it's not all happily ever after. In this life, we sometimes think that everything has to be just right, perfect and happy, and if we're looking for that in this life, then we're looking for the wrong thing, because that isn't going to happen here. In this life, we have our troubles. That's part of what makes heaven so precious. Now, as we go through struggles in life, hopefully we can go through that with a mate. But if not, and we are called on to do that by ourselves, due to our choices or choices of others, then we must go on and make the very best we can of that, and make that new chapter, rewrite what it is we're going to do, and have new plans. And obviously, the goal is to please God. Paul talked about leaving the things that are behind and pressing on to the high call in Christ Jesus. Marriage and partnership with our mate may have been our goal, but the ultimate goal has not changed. The ultimate goal is going to heaven, and that goal should never change. So I just encourage you to do one day at a time, living in that moment and doing the next right thing. That's how our marriages, that's how it's going to work for us when we are single, when we are grieving. Allow yourself to feel your feelings, but do not allow your feelings to overwhelm you or override your wisdom in doing the things God would have you do. It's a process. It's not going to happen that we just suddenly get over somebody. But in time, one morning we wake up, and that's not the first thing on our mind. That person's not the first thing on our mind. That won't happen for a while. But we can wake up and we can move on. It's hard to adjust. We do a good job in this life of welcoming people to the world. We have baby showers, and we kind of coo with the babies, and the men kind of stand back, but the women like that kind of stuff, and the men don't know how to act, so they try to figure it out. But we do a pretty good job of welcoming people, but we do a pretty lousy job of saying goodbye. Well, life is beginnings and endings. We walk on the stage, we live the stage of life, and we graduate. And at that graduation, we want to hear the Lord say, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Here's your diploma. Here's your crown of life. Let's enter into the joys of the Lord." You may have to do that by yourself. You may not have a partner to walk with you on that journey, but you do. You have the Lord. He walks with you. He's with you every step of the way. Sometimes he carries you, and he will carry you. He's there. I love you, brethren. I've known many of you from other places. It's a joy to see you in the audience again as I speak with you. But I tell you what, the greatest joy is the joy of going home. Well done. Well run. Congratulations. If you need to have prayers this morning, maybe something is troubling you, grieving you in your life, and you just need to ask us for prayers, this is the time we're going to sing a song. And in that song, if you just need some special prayers for help of some sort, why don't you come up here and let us pray with you? Or if you are one that has something in your life that is severing you in your relationship, and you don't want your relationship to end, you want help from God and from your brethren, come forward. Let us pray with you and help you. I've got the whole afternoon. If you'd like to talk with me, I'd be glad to talk with you. But we don't have to hurt, and we don't have to be alone. We have each other. But more so, we have God. Let's use those resources. We can help you. And you need to make some amends this morning. If you want to be baptized into Christ, or whatever way we can help you to be better spiritually, we invite you to come as we stand and sing. Take my heart and let me consecrate.